How is the morphology and syntax affected for this population? In Down syndrome, there's delays, but the pattern of development overall is the same. So it's the same course of development, like they develop things in the same order, but it's just delayed overall. In Williams syndrome, their grammar skills are similar, but might be slightly below, but not too bad. And then Fragile X, there's significant delays, but this gap actually narrows as they grow older. So this is one area that they kind of catch up in. Overall, it's just grammatical structure. Semantics or vocabulary now. There's some contrasting results in the literature right now suggesting that Down syndrome actually has the best vocabulary compared to other intellectual disabilities. But overall, right now, it's widely accepted that overall they still have delayed vocabulary when compared to a typical peer. So yes, they might have better vocabulary than some other intellectually disabled categories, but compared to typical age peers, they're still behind. Williams syndrome, this is fascinating. They actually happen to have a really large and sophisticated vocabulary. So something about this genetic change actually makes this a strength to them, and including organization and receptive language skills. That's similar to typically developing children. And then Fragile X, there's different subtypes, and there are different types of Down syndrome. The most common one is the one on the 21st chromosome, which is why we call it trisomy 21. Fragile X, we just know less about, and because there's variations in vocabulary, the research doesn't really tell us too much at this point specifically about their vocabulary. But from my experience, just on that, it's pretty similar. Fragile X and Down syndrome are pretty similar. And so this book breaks them apart, but the kids I've worked with, overall, they're similar. Their facial features are definitely different, but anyway. Looking at social skills, pragmatics, conversational competence, so things like turn taking, topic maintenance, all those things I'm always talking to you about. They actually have few errors. And so if we're talking first about just conversational things, and we're going to go further into a different area of pragmatics, but just looking on conversational, they have few errors with turn taking, meaning they understand a typical conversation you're going to have turn taking. That doesn't mean it's always easy for them to be patient and wait their turn, but it's not easy for my 2 or 4-year-old either, and they're neurotypical, and you want to talk. The thing is that sometimes they might have difficulty with contributing, and they might certainly have difficulty with repairing a conversation, meaning realizing that somebody didn't understand what they said and they should say it a different way. That would be hard for them to do without some prompting. Williams syndrome, another interesting thing is they are actually hypersocial, and so maybe more than typical. And they have difficulty taking turns with topic maintenance, and they have difficulty with perseverating. If they get on one thing, they just want to stay on that. They can't move past it. So not necessarily that it's a high interest. That might be one example. They really want to talk about something. But perseverating might be like that a kid approaches them and is like, how are you? And he says, I'm good. But my dog passed away, and then that kid just cannot get over that for the rest of the conversation. The other kid wants to move on past that topic, and he just finds something and just perseverates on it, can't even move past it. Not even that it's of high interest, but it's like their brain just sticks to that and can't move on. And in Fragile X, they have more off-topic discourse. They have that perseveration. And right here, it's talking about, because a major area in ASD that kid qualifies for is their social communication. And so they're saying that there is a comorbidity rate of between 60 to 75%. So kids that have Fragile X often also meet the criteria for ASD. Overall, in this area, I would say that's where you see more differences between Down syndrome and Fragile X. If you've met someone with Down syndrome, they're almost always really friendly. Fragile X, they struggle more with social things that might make them appear less social. The reality is all humans want to be social. It's just that some of us show it more than others. Then when we're talking about just basic speech acts like their need to request or command or ask for help, that kind of thing. Across all disabilities, this is harder, and it makes sense because if their articulation is more difficult, if their vocabulary is lacking, then their ability to get their wants and needs met is going to be delayed. It's significantly delayed, but overall, there's some catch up to their peers. And in individuals with Down syndrome, there is a difference, and that is they appear less polite. Some of my favorite kids have Down syndrome, and I think it's because I don't view it as not polite because I don't think that it's intentional. I just think they're sassy sometimes, and maybe that's a judgment I shouldn't make. But I've always just loved their spunk, and they are very stubborn. They can be very stubborn, and so maybe they don't always use their manners. But those are some of my favorite people in the world. And it sounds weird, I've talked about this with other colleagues, that you could have like a favorite disability. That's one of my favorite ones, which sounds weird, but if you've ever had kids you've worked with or friends with Down syndrome, they're really special. Then this last area, referential communication, the ability to explain a task to another person. This becomes more important the older you get because you do this a lot in your learning. So maybe your teacher asks you to explain your book report or explain the steps of the scientific method to the class, so maybe not early childhood, but by later elementary and on, you're called on a lot to explain things. And then just like when I'm teaching, if I want to be able to explain something to you, I have to study it. I have to know it better to be able to teach it. And so this area is really hard for them. They're better. Individuals with Down syndrome are better at understanding directions than giving them. And they just overall use fewer descriptions, and they request on their partner a lot more, but that just comes from their lack in vocabulary. There's not specific research about Williams that wasn't listed in your book, and the same with Down syndrome Fragile X. They're better at understanding. Their receptive language is higher than their expressive language in this area, and they just use less consistent reference, which might make it harder to understand them. They don't always know how to share context with others to help with understanding, so sometimes there's increased confusion.